Hi, I'm Adrienne Elise, and today I wanted to talk to you about a concept called Esoteric Loneliness. So on the spiritual journey, it seems that there are necessary times where we find ourselves feeling completely isolated. I wanted to just talk about this a little bit. This is an illusion on one level because we know that quantum physics has proven that we are a part of the whole. So how can we feel lonely if we're actually a particle of creation? And yet we do. So we're going to explore this topic, what might lead to this feeling, what this feeling might be about, and explore some energies of different traditions. So this is a very common feeling that comes up in souls on a spiritual journey and awakening souls, that when we go through the process of stopping our toxic relationships. And so when we decide that we're ready to own our light and our power and we don't want to feed unconscious forces. Now, this is really common in these types of souls that are drawn to my work: empath, light worker, indigo, starseed souls, advanced souls, but that are usually surrounded by karmic relationships where it's of a lower vibrational energy, where people around you aren't able to connect with you on that spiritual vibration. This has to do with karmic contracts from past lives that we need to clear in order to move into more spiritual-based relationships. These karmic contracts end up being like a net. So the only people that can get through in that period of time when we're working through these contracts are people that we have these contracts with. And it's very difficult because once you start having boundaries and recognizing that you have a source of light within you and you don't want to be feeding unconscious energies, part of the deal is that these souls are healer souls and fixer souls. They want to help and so when we're interacting with people, a lot of times they'll have compassion to see through and say, well, that person is hurting and I should give them some of my light. And yet, is that really serving the greater good? Because that means your light is like a commodity, like an investment in shadow energies or in unconscious energies. And perhaps you're more enabling them to stay in unconscious energies instead of supporting them into coming into the spiritual light. And the only way we can really bring people into spiritual light and into more awareness is to leave them behind in order to demonstrate what's possible. So what happens when we start cutting ourselves off from toxic relationships or the narcissistic relationships, because these empaths and very sensitive souls are often targeted by these types of energies. And so we have to learn boundaries. So that seems to be a big part of what the journey is for this empath sensitive soul. And it feels good when you can do that, to set those boundaries, to take back your energy for yourself. But a lot of times it leads to deep pathological loneliness, like a feeling like there is nobody out there that you can connect to, nobody you can talk to about what's really going on, and it makes you feel like you're going crazy. Now, this is just a part of the journey, though, and it's important to understand that it's temporary and it's a place that you're visiting along the way. So, this loneliness, we talked about how, if we're a particle of God and creation, then does it even make sense to be lonely? Because can't we access that energy of everything within us? And how can you feel alone, right? And then we have that challenge of putting boundaries, which is the important lesson of empaths, holding your light for yourself, holding your light sacred and precious for more conscious pursuits. But then we come up with this. So loneliness is an illusion, but it's a reality when you're going through these things and on your path and process. But we also need to understand that loneliness, or that human connection, is a necessary part of survival as human species. So as much as we are star beings and connected to everything and have this bigger, wider self and bigger, wider truth, still in a human body in this experience for survival, babies that are not given attention and given connection do not thrive. So it's a very tricky situation, because it's like, well, loneliness is an illusion and it's part of my spiritual journey, and that's fine. And I'm just going to go hibernate and, hermit and be with myself and find that place within me that feels good. And yet we do need to seek out connection in order to thrive in this world. So once you get your karmic relationships worked out and you give yourself permission to own your light, then you can clear the way for more of the soul group, soulmate type of relationships to come through. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get into this subject. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Edgar Cayce. He was a psychic that was lived at the beginning of the last century and into the 30s and 40s. And he was called the sleeping prophet because he would go to sleep, put himself in a trance, like self-hypnosis, and he would be able to read people's past lives, and he could read people's astrology charts, and he could do health readings where he could scan the body and say exactly what needed to be done for people to be healed. Really quite amazing. But one of the things that he talked about was in one of the readings, he gave a very specific picture and story of what it's like for him to go into this trance. Every time he gave a reading, he had this experience. And he talked about, I wanted to just read to you a little bit about what he said in that reading, as every single time he goes into this trance, this is what he experiences. And he said, I find myself oppressed by darkness, and there is a feeling of terrific loneliness. Suddenly, I'm conscious of a white beam of light. As this tiny dot, I move upward, following the light, knowing that I must follow it or be lost. So this tells us a little bit metaphorically about the process we're in. And that feeling of oppression and darkness and loneliness is a part of a journey back to the light. Now, he goes on to talk about how he goes through a place where there's disfigured humans and scary things out of nightmares. This is like the lower astral plane. And then he gets to hooded figures that are putting their energy down, and then gradually different colors, lighter colors, and energies as he gets into the light. And then all of a sudden, he'll find himself in a hall of records. This is the Akashic records he talks about, where there is a record stored in our life force body and in our astral body from this and other lifetimes. And there's a collective Akashic records, and then we have an individual Akashic records of all the experiences we've ever experienced. And that's how psychic readers, that's what they're accessing. But I think it's just a really important picture for all of us, because we are trying to ascend or move into the light, have this shift of consciousness, and the oppressive darkness, and then this energy of that terrific loneliness is how he described it. And that he had to find that beam of light and see himself as a tiny dot and follow the light. And that's kind of where we're at right now. So many souls feeling in this oppressive darkness and loneliness. And yet we know we are the light. So we got to hold on to that and be present with it and see the bigger picture of what we're going through. So the other thing I wanted to talk about comes from the work of Rudolf Steiner. He was also a clairvoyant. He was in Europe, and Edgar Cayce was in the U.S., but they lived around the same time at the turn of the century, at the beginning of last century, and into Steiner was more at the 20s and 30s. And so where his work was really coming forward. So Rudolf Steiner talks about the Buddha. And he talks about the process and the concept of the Bodhisattva. So Bodhisattva is like a teacher, a master of light that is incarnated into the earth plane. And he said that before Buddha became Buddha, Buddha was a Bodhisattva. And so it's really interesting to look at this process of where Buddha became the Bodhisattva that was became Buddha, and this process and what this is about. So the energy of the Bodhisattva is, Rudolf Steiner talks about that the energy of this type of soul is so big that they can't find a body that can fit and host their light. Now, this is an interesting message that's come through again and again over the years of my spiritual research in these souls. And part of the reason these souls feel so fractured and so uncomfortable and so compressed here in this lower dimensional frequency is because you're so much bigger dimensionally. And yet there's the energies on the planet when you incarnated and the bodies available can't quite host all of your light. And it's really interesting that Rudolf Steiner talked about this. And he talked about the old masters, like say the prophets of the Old Testament, were these type of souls. And so it was kind of a regular thing that only part of them could incarnate. And part of them stayed in the spiritual world. So he talked about these prophets being impelled by spirit. Like almost like this part of themselves that couldn't be incarnated was working on them from the outside. And so this part of them lives in the spiritual world, and that it was necessary for these prophets to withdraw into solitude in order to connect with that part of their spirit. So this is really interesting because it's telling us that, wait a minute, maybe this loneliness is because I'm not here. You're lonely for your own self. You're lonely for this bigger part of you that our world is just constantly trying to disconnect us from and invalidate and say it's not true. And it's like we've got this lower matrix grid and all this technological interference keeping us from this connection. So no wonder we have to go to that place of isolation in order to connect with our higher self, especially if the people around us are continually, because they're just not on that level, invalidating that experience. We've got to go within, and we've got to go into solitude in order to connect with that bigger self. And so, but they would go into solitude for this inspiration from spirit, and they'd get their teachings, they'd get their messages, but it was from their own part of themselves in the spiritual world. And so it makes sense we would feel lonely with the people around us who don't understand and can't validate or have a sense of what this experience is like. And so it's interesting because he talks about how Buddha brought on the wrath of the Brahmas. So the Brahmas were like the teachers of the time that Buddha lived. And Buddha really angered them because he talked about how the growth of the soul and the person and the abilities in this spiritual process has to do with the individual process. Whereas up to that point, it was the idea that you were kind of born with it through your lineage, through your bloodline, right? So this was a radical teaching of that time, and it holds a really important piece for us. Because he said that the efforts of the personal and the individual is what gets you along on the path of your spiritual journey, not the gifts of your ancestors, right? And we know that because a lot of times it's more like a poison toxicity that we get from our ancestral lineage. And so we can look at this story of Buddha. He had a palace. He was protected from everything. He had all of this wealth. He was his dad was a king, and he left all of that behind. He left all of it behind. He left his family. Supposedly he had a wife and children. I didn't know that. He left it all behind because he knew he had a spiritual purpose and a path. And so he became homeless. And that's an interesting energy, right? Because so many of these souls that are drawn to this work feel homeless on the earth. Like they don't really fit in this third dimensional reality. It's like a square peg in a round hole, and it just doesn't, it hurts kind of. It's just too compressed, too dense. But this is why we're here on the planet right now, because we are changing the energies and changing ourselves and bringing in the light. And so as you do go through your awakening process, you will get lighter and freer. But there are these times of deep loneliness and deep oppression. So there's an energy here that Rudolf Steiner talked about these souls, these Bodhisattva souls and these prophets having to become liberated from their family connections, if you can relate to that. Maybe these are these relationships and the karma. And like, so as an advanced soul, part of the energy of this lifetime for a lot of these souls is to complete all of this karma. So there's like intense stuff that you didn't deal with, that you left for last in a way. And these are these difficult relationships often with your intimate family, your close family members. And so it can be very difficult and karmic relationships. But part of that has to do with wanting to pull those patterns out by the roots. So if you experience them when you're really young, before your ego has formed, perhaps if you can come through and heal and come out of the damage that was done, you can let go of those patterns and not have to incarnate again in the same way. That's what Rudolf Steiner said about Buddha. When he went from a bodhisattva, so he was a bodhisattva, and then in his life, when he sat under the Bodhi tree, he became the Buddha, right? And so becoming the Buddha meant that he had completed on some level this experience, and that he didn't need to come back to earth in the same way. Maybe he comes back, but not with a body, is kind of what I was getting. Or he could choose to come in a body if he wanted, but it's not out of karmic responsibility and those kinds of things. So that's a lot of what these souls, I see that in astrology charts a lot that I work with in these souls, like really clear messages like, yeah, I've got a lot on my plate because I want to be complete with this. I want to remember who I am. I don't want to forget who I am. I want to come back to earth just as a pure service and a light being, but not out of karma. So this is something that he said about these bodhisattva souls and the Buddha, is that he had to experience all of the pain that can be felt when a man must bid farewell to everything that is near him and stand alone. And this is something that comes up in Rudolf Steiner's work a lot, that what we're doing here is differentiating ourselves on our spiritual journey from our ancestral and societal, the conditioning and things like that. But the main thing we're doing is to claim our own spiritual identity, our own spiritual path, separate from our ancestral influences. But that requires him to leave everything and stand alone. So that kind of might make sense. Now, it's really cool because Rudolf Steiner referenced also a quote from the Bible from Mark 3:35. And this is a quote from Jesus. And it says, somebody said this to him. And it's along these lines, and I think a really important concept. Somebody says to him, "Thy mother and thy brethren are without and seek for thee." And he replies, "That they are not." And Rudolf Steiner says this is a literal, like sometimes we look at the Bible and those energies as metaphorical, right? But it's like, he said, no, this is a literal translation here. And he was making the point that those blood relationships are not necessarily your soul relationships, And then the quote is, Steiner said he was making the point to those that were with him, that those that were with him in free community of soul. Really beautiful picture. This is like our true soul group that we're preparing and bringing into our life once we can clear and heal these toxic relationships. And then Jesus said, "Whoever shall do the will of God, the same is my brother and my sister and mother." So it's like we're in a free community of soul together. That's what joins us and bonds us, is that connection to the spirit, connection to the divine. So he's saying that as Rudolf Steiner is saying, that's a very literal quote in the Bible. And what Steiner said about this is that in order that one being might proclaim universal love, so he's talking about Jesus and the Christ consciousness, he had actually to be incarnated in a form where he could experience the abandonment of everything that could be founded upon ties of blood. And so I think this has to do with some of this loneliness, feeling like you don't have that family support for your journey. Typically, these souls do not have people around them it can happen, but in, their mother, family, sibling relationships that are recognizing and supportive of this journey. Now, this is something that very advanced souls, it's a very difficult and painful place to come to this realization. It has to do with these toxic relationships, but that oftentimes as a bright light soul, what's happened for a series of lifetimes is that everybody around you and all of your relationships were actually control-based relationships. And they were there to protect you from your own power, which meant they're actually feeding on your power and your light. So many of these souls feel like they are the scapegoat of their family, and just cannot do anything right and have no value in that world. And yet they are the light. And an example would be like when something really goes down in the family and some real deep, something happens, a death or something, they're going to come to you for support, because you're the one they want to be around in that time. And so we have to look at these lies. And so, but if you've had this series of lifetimes where all you've known is control-based relationships, then of course you're going to have to work out those karmic contracts with all of those control-based relationship souls. And then you have to recognize that what you might see as love, your definition of love, might be control. And we have to completely rewire and change our whole concept of reality around what love is. And of course, that's going to require some isolation, just by the part of it. So that seems like that sheds a little bit of light on this process of why we have such difficult relationships with our blood family and why we need to disconnect and be okay without that net of support, because it's not actual support. Because they're generally not able to validate. So part of this control-based energy is a constant invalidation of who you are as a soul, constant invalidation of your spiritual mission and your journey, everything there to distract you from that. It's like, oh no, that's not important. That's not real. You're just silly, you're crazy, you're, this. And that's something you've been told, the picture that's been painted for you over lifetimes. So it's quite a lot to overcome, be able to claim back your true spiritual purpose and who you really are as a soul when nobody around you can validate that. So now we talked about this though, like connection, soul connections, it's connection with human. It's just a basic human need. So it's not something, to take lightly, and something really important. And it's become a passion of mine to connect these souls together, help them find each other. Because one of the things that came through the Edgar Cayce readings is that we've had these masters, right? Like Buddha and Christ, like that's Jesus, that's an example of these masters. And what they were showing us is this path of spiritual enlightenment. And it was like one master showing us and one person having this ascension experience showing us what's possible. But the time that we're in now and what we're moving into in our spiritual process, the spiritual ascension is happening in groups. So no wonder. So this is what I wanted to talk about, is that these soul groups that we all have it. Every single soul has a group of souls that you've been together with from ancient, from the beginning of time. And these are so different than your family members typically, and their soul group. It's like, so you guys are very similar type of souls, and what you're going through right now, your whole soul group is wrestling with the exact same issues, exact same problems. So it's another reason that loneliness is an illusion. And I see this every day when I do individual sessions, because a big part of my sessions have become working with the soul group. And because then we can look at the issues of the soul group and find what's going on and use the individual's past life as a way to offer healing to the soul group, open up channels of communication between the soul group members, and amplify the healing for the individual. But one of the interesting things that happens, it's like pretty much every single time I'll go tap into the soul group and invite them in to observe the the lifetime picture. Now, what really connects these soul groups, what ultimately brings you together, is these shared past life experiences, not necessarily in the same, like you've had very similar experiences in your past lives, not necessarily at the same time and place. And so, but what really connects them together energetically is a connection to an ancient origin lineage, like way, way, way beyond the formation of this planet, and these kind of archetypes, ancient lineages. And so there's typically an energy, a symbol, a purpose to this soul group and what they're here on the planet for. And it's like, this whole earth evolution. So, but when I look at these soul groups, inevitably they come together in a group, in a clump, but they don't see each other. They're like, a lot of times I'll see pictures of them being kind of almost like tied up, or they're looking down at the ground. They can't see around themselves because they're so caught up in their own experience, and they don't have a sense that they're going through these experiences with their soul group. And it's such a cool thing because typically by the end of the session, it goes from being like they're right next to each other, but they can't see each other. And then they're like, oh, hey, how's it going? And so it's a really cool energy and kind of what we're moving into on the planet, especially with this 2020 energy, because two is about working together as a team. And so it's about finding those soulmates and soul groups and inviting these, clearing the karmic net and connecting with your soul group, finding permission and worthiness within yourself, vibrational resonance with this level of support, so that you can find these people in your life. So I wanted to talk just a little bit more about, bring forward some ideas brought forward by one of my favorite teachers, Mooji. Maybe you've heard of Mooji, but he talks about, he kind of has a beautiful combination of the Buddhist stream of thinking and as well as Christian and pure esoteric Christianity. And so he talks about this I am presence and how, and this is kind of this illusion of loneliness, because like we said, quantum physics has shown we're a part of God and we can conceptualize that, but we don't always feel a part of God. We often feel, and part of this is that as we separate from these toxic relationships, as we empaths and these sensitive souls have to learn boundaries. It's a big part of the journey. But then you boundary up, and you've got walls and fortresses, and you can't connect and you can't trust anymore. And it's hard after you've been so burned by people who misused your trust and misled you and took advantage of you as a trusting, compassionate soul. And that's where we have to be like, and then the empath typically beats themselves up. Oh, I didn't see it. I let myself be taken advantage of, and I'm so weak, and da-da-da. And it's like, no, your light, your sensitivity, your compassion, and your trust, ability to trust, is your greatest gift. And it's what the planet needs right now. So that's a big shift that is part of this whole journey, and coming into valuing and recognizing the honor of honoring these gifts that you have, that our society says are rather weak and don't really have any value, and crazy or whatever, and scapegoat. But it's like, as you evolve as a soul, you get more and more sensitive. So those really sensitive, souls, when you feel like you can barely function because so much is just coming in at you, that is actually a symptom of your level of consciousness and your hard work and experiences you've done over so many lifetimes and whole evolutions. You've gone through spiritual ascension numerous times. And it's time for us to stand up and value that, and value this truth and compassion, the purity of these souls. And so the reason why you've been, the very reason you were sucked into those toxic relationships is because of these gifts. And now we can learn healthy boundaries and still have connection to healthy people once we can clear those contracts and take our power back and make sure that we're holding sacred this light and not feeding the unconscious energies. So when we're looking at this I am presence, this is kind of a concept that Mooji talks about and a lot of spiritual teachers do, but in this case, this really struck me in one of his presentations, which I'll link below if you want to watch the whole satsang that he gave and where this came from. But he was talking about this I am presence, which is like, we all say I am this, I am that, I am that. So the I am, and you can see this like in the animals and the plants and the earth, like they're all I am, they're in the presence, they're in the connection, right? And then we come into our consciousness as humans of our ability to think and self-reflect or, know who we are. And we lose that connection to the I am. But it's like we evolved beyond, so we have what the animals have. We have it within us. We have that presence of connection, but seems so difficult to get a handle on in this time. So one of the things he said in this satsang was, you are looking out from the immensity and you are the immensity. In the immensity of all things, even the tiniest spot has consciousness, has a sense of wholeness inside of it. And it's interesting because it goes back to the beginning of this video with Edgar Cayce's story. And he's like a tiny dot and he's just like looking for the light, knowing that he's got to hold on to that light to make it through. And he went through everything. He gave thousands, like 15,000, close to, it's like 14,000 readings. And he did that every time. Anyway, so this tiniest spot has, as consciousness, has a sense of wholeness inside of itself. We have this wholeness inside of ourselves. We just have to remember and reconnect to it and allow space in our lives for that. And that's the thing, when you break your toxic relationships, you go through a deep, deep pathological loneliness, and you have to just work through those feelings. And but the true thing that Mooji's talking about is that when you do open up to this connection within, it's like you're fine being alone, because you're like, oh, this energy feels so good. But then we also have to look at whether we feel like we deserve it, because Mooji's giving a very direct teaching that you are this and go ahead and be that. And of course, that's a little difficult when we feel like we don't deserve it. It's like, okay, well, conceptually that makes sense, but like, can I really just be God presence? Like, because it feels really good, but we're programmed to think that like we don't deserve that, or that's not okay, or somehow it's taking away from other people, or we need to stay in suffering with everybody else, so there's a lot of programming around it, but it's a powerful concept. And so he brought up a Rumi quote, and the Rumi quote is that you are not merely a drop in the ocean, you are also the ocean in a drop. And so it's like, this is the quantum physics thing. It's like, you can't get away from the wholeness. It's like, you are a fractal. And in the fractal, the whole exists in the fractal of consciousness of God right here inside of you. And can you go be with yourself, is what Mooji was saying here. Can you go be with yourself? And find the sense of completeness, that we are linked by definition and by birthright to this completeness. And so he says, sit with yourself and understand that the I am is already there before anything else. The I am was there before you were a woman or a man or this role or that role or any lifetime. You were the I am, and it's always been there. And it's nothing, you did not earn it, is kind of one of the things that really struck me. It's like, you didn't earn this. It's just there. And can you let yourself allow it? And it's interesting because we cut off those toxic relationships. We feel deep pathological loneliness because we're addicted to these bad energetic, where it's like the codependent energy, where we have to give and try to heal in order to feel like we're worthy of our own energy. And then we cut off our relationships and we feel so lonely. But it's like, wait a minute. Like, okay, so you had to go through these drastic actions of cutting off relationships because they were feeding on your light and your energy. But why don't you have permission to feed on it? Why are you feeling so crappy? You're the one, you're the source that they wanted. And more as we're moving through our society today, these narcissistic tendencies are so powerful everywhere, and they will find you. It's like part of the path of the journey for the empath to work through this type of story and relationships and understand. And it's like the light of the soul is becoming a rare commodity, and you better hold on to that. And why not enjoy it? Everybody else, you might have been feeding your whole family. I mean, sometimes these souls, like thousands of people in their field, they don't even know that they're like serving and offering their energy to. And then when they're alone, they feel empty. So it's like, can you go be with yourself, and move through those feelings of the illusion of loneliness and come into that I am presence. So thank you so much for being on the journey and listening through this video, and hang in there with these feelings, and know that there's a bigger path to this, because grabbing a hold of that light, like Edgar Cayce said, and moving in to the higher realms where perhaps the bigger truth of ourselves lives, because it can't quite fit here in this narrow reality. So go ahead and validate yourself in all of these ways, and support and honor your light, because it is ready. It's time to land fully and completely at home. Your true home, soul family, at home on planet Earth. And it's an amazing time to be here, and it's an exciting time to be alive here together on the planet. So many light workers. I've seen that in past times, light workers would come in these groups, not necessarily in the same location, right, but around the planet. And these groups are like, they're all here right now. So it's a really exciting time once we can get through the delusion of it all. So thanks so much, and I look forward to seeing you soon on the next video. Until then, I'm Adrienne Elise. Namaste.